Everything looks completely normal when you walk through the automatic sliding doors of a Walmart today. The fluorescent lights hum, the great value labels are neatly aligned, and the prices seem stable. But that normalcy is an illusion. The next 60 days represent a critical window because the items about to experience significant price spikes don't look vulnerable right now. That is the fundamental paradox of the modern supply chain. Retail price increases do not originate on the supermarket shelf. They are born months in advance, in diesel fuel surcharges, international freight contracts, fertilizer futures, and corporate supplier agreements signed in closed boardrooms long before an employee changes a single digital price tag. By the time the consumer notices the shift, the financial damage is already done. Right now, 12 specific grocery staples are sitting in this quiet, deceptive operational gap. On the surface, their prices are static. Underneath, the macroeconomic pressure is reaching a breaking point. The United States Department of Agriculture has already documented that food costs have surged by over 25% since 2020, and the structural shifts coming into effect this summer represent the next major wave of this inflationary reality. Let's start with the foundation of the American pantry: all-purpose flour. It is the item that surprises consumers the most, and that very surprise is what makes it dangerous. Rows of paper bags stacked high give a psychological sense of infinite abundance. But flour isn't just a single product on a shelf. It is the economic baseline for dozens of secondary goods. Sandwich bread, hamburger buns, frozen pizzas, dry pasta, and crackers all trace their costs back to the wholesale price of wheat. The average American consumes roughly 130 to 140 pounds of wheat products annually. When wheat faces supply shocks, the damage ripples silently through the entire grocery cart. Currently, the primary wheat-producing states, Kansas, North Dakota, and Montana, are battling severe multi-year drought cycles and erratic weather patterns. Simultaneously, the input costs for nitrogen-based fertilizers and agricultural diesel remain stubbornly high. As large retailers prepare to renegotiate major supply contracts for the second half of the year, this upstream pressure is bound to break through. While Walmart's house brand currently undercuts regional supermarket chains, that pricing delta relies on supply metrics that are fundamentally fractured. Then there is honey, an item facing a completely different set of pressures. Honey is one of the few foods that biologically defies time. When archaeologists excavated centuries-old Egyptian tombs, they discovered jars of honey that were still chemically stable and perfectly edible. This indefinite shelf life stems from a unique low-moisture, high-acid profile that prevents microbial growth entirely. It is a dual-purpose staple, serving as a natural sweetener, a baking component, and a traditional wellness remedy, making it an exceptionally high-utility asset to lock in at current prices. Yet, domestic honey production is cratering due to systemic commercial bee colony collapses, leaving the market heavily reliant on imports that are now facing aggressive new tariff adjustments. The margin between Walmart's current shelf price and the true cost of global procurement is shrinking fast. The volatility becomes even more acute when you walk over to the dairy and egg cases. Consider how shoppers interact with the egg aisle. It has become the unofficial litmus test for the entire household budget. People check egg prices, not just to buy them, but to gauge the true state of inflation. Eggs are a foundational, nutritionally complete protein that binds the American diet together. But the underlying supply side is devastated. The recent waves of highly pathogenic avian influenza forced the culling of over 40 million laying hens across the country. Restocking these commercial facilities takes months of biological growth, all while the cost of feed for the surviving flocks remains elevated. The current retail pricing is a lagging indicator. As spring contracts expire and summer renewals take effect, the window for cheap protein is closing. The story repeats itself with ground beef, though the structural crisis here is even deeper. The United States beef cattle herd has shrunken to its smallest size since 1951. We are looking at a 70-year low in domestic cattle inventory. This isn't a temporary market fluctuation. It is the direct result of prolonged droughts that forced ranchers to liquidate their breeding cows just to survive financially. You can replant a wheat field in a single season, but you cannot accelerate the biology of a cow. A pregnancy takes 9 months, and a calf requires roughly 2 years to reach market weight. This means the supply deficit currently baked into the system will persist well into the late 2020s. The large family packs at Walmart offer a temporary reprieve in cost per pound metrics, but the macro reality is unyielding. Even butter, which requires a staggering 21 pounds of whole milk to produce just a single pound of finished product, amplifies every single volatility in the agricultural sector. When fuel, feed, and farm labor increase by even a small percentage, that 21-to-1 ratio multiplies the cost shock exponentially before the product ever hits the refrigerated truck. The same economic gravity is pulling at peanut butter, a caloric powerhouse found in 90% of American homes, where surging logistics fees and processing costs are squeezing the margins of southern producers. Further down the aisles, global geography traps take over. Extra virgin olive oil is reeling from 3 consecutive catastrophic harvests in Spain, a nation that dictates 40% of the world's supply. Multi-year droughts in the Mediterranean have sent global olive inventories to historic lows, and the price spikes that began at European farms are finally clearing international shipping lanes to hit domestic retail. Meanwhile, whole bean coffee is caught in a parallel vice. Brazil and Vietnam, which dictate over half of global production, have faced simultaneous severe climate disruptions, driving green coffee bean futures to unprecedented heights. From the wheat fields driving up the price of standard dry pasta to the global shipping networks bringing in canned tuna from the Pacific, the message across the entire food infrastructure is identical. These are not isolated anomalies. They are symptoms of an interconnected, highly stressed global apparatus. The shelf prices you see today are a snapshot of the past. The prices of tomorrow are already being decided. To fully comprehend how the retail food infrastructure reached this critical inflection point, it is necessary to examine the underlying structural traps, policy decisions, and historical anomalies that have spent the last half-decade quietly breaking the agricultural supply chain. The current pricing crisis is not an overnight phenomenon. It is the mathematical compounding of structural errors and geographical realities that began accelerating in 2020. When the global pandemic destabilized traditional shipping networks, it exposed a fragile, just-in-time inventory system that American retail giants like Walmart had relied on for decades to keep consumer prices artificially depressed. That system operates on the assumption that global logistics will always function without friction, an assumption that the last few years have thoroughly disproven. The primary driver of the impending retail price corrections sits within the agricultural fuel and transportation sector. In the United States, commercial freight distribution relies entirely on diesel fuel. According to data from the Energy Information Administration, diesel fuel costs experienced historic volatility between 2022 and 2025, directly inflating the per-mile operating costs for regional distributors. Because food products are heavy, low-margin commodities, transport costs cannot be absorbed by processors. They are passed directly down the line. When a refrigerated tractor-trailer moves agricultural goods from California's Central Valley or the Texas Panhandle to regional distribution centers, the fuel surcharge alone can add thousands of dollars to a single shipment. This structural reality creates a geographic trap. The further a retail location sits from the point of primary production, the more vulnerable its inventory becomes to systemic transportation spikes. Simultaneously, domestic agricultural production has been severely undermined by international geopolitical conflicts and their subsequent impact on fertilizer supply chains. In 2022, global supply disruptions involving major exporters of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus inputs sent fertilizer prices soaring to record highs. Although commodity markets stabilized slightly by late 2024, the baseline cost of running a large-scale farming operation in the American Midwest remains structurally elevated compared to pre-2020 averages. Farm credit data indicates that operating loans for domestic growers reached peak interest rates during this period, forcing agricultural operations to pay more to finance their seeds, equipment, and seasonal labor. These front-end expenses create a lagging economic fuse that is detonating on supermarket shelves right now. The case of the domestic beef industry offers the clearest illustration of a biological and geographic trap colliding with corporate retail realities. The contraction of the US beef cattle herd to its lowest level since 1951 was not a conscious choice made by ranchers to restrict supply. It was a desperate reaction to persistent meteorological extremes. Between 2021 and 2024, severe drought conditions blanketed the exceptional drought categories across Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, regions that collectively account for a massive percentage of the nation's cattle grazing land. When pastures dried up and natural water sources vanished, the cost of purchasing supplemental hay escalated beyond the financial capacity of independent cattlemen. Ranchers were forced into a catastrophic liquidation phase, sending millions of breeding cows and heifers to slaughterhouses ahead of schedule to prevent bankruptcy. The immediate result of this mass liquidation was a short-term surplus of beef on the market, which kept retail ground beef prices relatively stable through 2023. However, this created a massive, unavoidable supply cliff for the mid-2020s. In cattle ranching, breeding stock represents the future production capacity of the entire industry. By slaughtering the cows that generate the next generation of calves, the agricultural sector effectively hollowed out its future inventory. Because a beef cow requires roughly 2 years to rear a single calf to market weight, the industry cannot simply increase production when demand rises or weather conditions improve. The liquidation of the herd created a multi-year structural deficit that cannot be corrected by capital investments or government subsidies before the late 2020s. A similar geographic crisis occurred within the international dairy sector, which dictates the pricing structure for household butter. The strict 21-to-1 ratio required to manufacture butter means that the product acts as an economic magnifier for any instability in raw milk production. In the major dairy regions of Wisconsin, California, and Idaho, producers faced escalating compliance costs, labor shortages, and rising feed costs. Alfalfa hay, a primary component of dairy cattle diets, reached record price levels due to water restrictions in western states. When raw milk yields fell, processing plants prioritized fluid milk and cheese production to meet immediate market demands, leaving a smaller allocation of butterfat for processing facilities. This domestic shortage forced commercial buyers to look toward global markets, right as international maritime freight rates began climbing due to logistical bottlenecks in major shipping canals. The international trade arena has introduced further instability into everyday dry goods and pantry items like honey and olive oil. For over a decade, the United States market relied heavily on imported honey from overseas producers to supplement declining domestic yields. However, consecutive anti-dumping duties and regulatory crackdowns by the Department of Commerce against major exporting nations dismantled these traditional supply corridors. These legal interventions were intended to protect domestic beekeepers from unfair foreign competition, but they occurred at the worst possible moment. Domestic bee populations were simultaneously suffering from colony collapse disorder, driven by pesticide exposure and habitat fragmentation. The convergence of these factors created a supply vacuum, causing wholesale honey prices to spike rapidly at the procurement level. The Mediterranean olive oil crisis presents another stark warning about the vulnerability of single-source global dependencies. When Spain experienced successive years of record-breaking heat waves and minimal rainfall between 2022 and 2024, the global olive oil market lost its primary stabilizing force. The Andalusian region, which typically acts as the engine of global production, saw its output cut in half. Because olive trees require specific climatic conditions and decades to mature, production cannot be relocated to alternative geographic zones to mitigate localized climate failures. The resulting scarcity triggered a frantic bidding war among international food conglomerates, driving the baseline cost of extra virgin olive oil to unprecedented levels on global commodity exchanges. Walmart and other massive retail operations managed to insulate consumers from the immediate shock of these global disruptions throughout the early 2020s by utilizing massive volume contracts. Corporate buyers lock in prices months, sometimes a year, in advance, forcing suppliers to absorb the initial financial hits. However, these historic agreements are not infinite. As these legacy contracts expire, corporate retail buyers are forced to renegotiate in a market where every single baseline cost is significantly higher than it was when the previous agreements were signed. The quiet period before the implementation of new contract cycles is ending, and the structural realities of the global supply chain are finally catching up to the consumer retail sector. The friction between current supermarket pricing and the operational reality of the food system is manifesting in a quiet regulatory and economic war across the industrial infrastructure of the United States. While consumers notice the final checkout total, the true friction exists in the complete polarization between independent agricultural producers, monolithic corporate aggregators, and tightening federal oversight. The current market structure has transformed basic food production into a high-stakes corporate calculation where thin margins leave zero room for error. When supply pressures compound, the resulting impasse triggers contract cancellations and massive regional bottlenecks before a single sticker is updated at retail locations. A primary example of this operational gridlock is occurring within the domestic poultry and egg sector. The United States Department of Agriculture has implemented aggressive biosecurity protocols to halt the transmission of highly pathogenic avian influenza, creating immediate operational friction for commercial producers. When federal inspectors identify a single positive case within a commercial facility, the mandate requires the immediate eradication of the entire flock to secure the broader food supply. For independent farmers operating under strict corporate supply agreements, these sudden liquidations shatter seasonal revenue projections. Processing corporations, facing sudden drops in input volumes, frequently invoke force majeure clauses in their contracts, shifting the entire financial burden back onto independent growers. As a result, agricultural credit networks are experiencing severe stress, with default rates on farm equipment loans creeping upward in key production zones. The structural gridlock in the beef sector is even more pronounced, creating a direct clash between independent cattle ranchers and the four corporate packing conglomerates that control over 80% of domestic processing capacity. While wholesale beef values and retail stakes have maintained historically high levels due to the decades' low cattle inventory, independent cow-calf operations are not capturing the windfall. The massive packing facilities dictate the purchase price of live cattle through forward contracting mechanisms, squeezing the operating margins of individual ranchers. Ranchers face a severe cash flow crisis, balancing the high cost of supplemental grain feed against the capped payouts from corporate processors. This financial pressure has accelerated the sale of remaining heifer herds to commercial feedlots, effectively prioritizing immediate survival over the long-term biological recovery of the national herd. The situation has triggered formal federal scrutiny, with lawmakers demanding antitrust investigations into the packer-dominated pricing structure. Yet the systemic consolidation leaves independent producers with virtually no alternative distribution channels. Simultaneously, the domestic grain supply chain is locked in a parallel crisis involving transportation infrastructure and international trade policy. The production of essential baking flour and dry pasta depends entirely on the reliable movement of bulk wheat from northern plain states to domestic mills and major distribution hubs. However, the Class 1 railroad networks have instituted major freight rate increases, citing rising maintenance costs and regulatory compliance updates. This transport friction is compounded by the ongoing consolidation of regional grain elevators by multinational agribusiness firms. Independent growers find themselves trapped between fixed regional elevator purchase prices and escalating freight surcharges. When international export demand fluctuates due to changing tariff structures, domestic inventories stall at the storage level, creating artificial localized gluts, while retail procurement costs remain elevated due to internal logistics fees. The global procurement pipeline for high-value imports like extra virgin olive oil and whole bean coffee presents an even deeper logistics impasse. Major retailers like Walmart rely on containerized maritime freight to stock their international food aisles, leaving them exposed to extreme volatility in the global shipping arena. Ongoing geopolitical disruptions in vital shipping lanes, combined with structural draft restrictions in major transit canals, have driven the spot market price for standard 40-foot cargo containers to multiples of their historical baselines. International shipping lines are prioritizing high-margin electronics and consumer goods over heavy, low-margin food commodities. Consequently, imported food shipments are facing extended delays at domestic port facilities, where rising demurrage and storage fees accumulate daily. These container-level cost accumulations do not disappear. They act as a hidden tariff that quietly compromises the pricing structures negotiated by corporate buyers months in advance. This systemic friction has forced major retail entities into a defensive operational posture. To maintain the appearance of price stability on core household staples, corporate operations are engaging in aggressive cost-shifting strategies behind the scenes. Suppliers are pressured to absorb lower margins or face losing access to primary shelf space entirely. In response, food processors are altering product specifications, reducing package weights while retaining identical pricing, a process documented across numerous consumer categories as hidden volumetric inflation. The operational buffer created by long-term corporate purchasing agreements is rapidly depleting. As these industrial contracts face mandatory renegotiation cycles amid sustained input cost pressures, the hidden costs accumulated throughout the farming, processing, and transportation sectors are converging on the retail interface, rendering the current